Hi everybody and welcome to my channel. In this episode I'm going to be talking about the IPP sentence and IPP prisoners. Now for those of you that don't know what IPP is, it stands for imprisonment for public protection, and it's an indefinite sentence and it's a 99-year sentence. But this sentence has got the UK, well not the UK, sorry, it's got the English prison system in absolute tatters. The English prison system is a shambles, and I've just done a video on Daniel Khalif, the escaped prisoner, who they call an escaped terrorist. And I've talked about the prison system and the absolute chaos that is actually happening inside of the prison system. The IPPs were brought out in 2005, and they were brought out for the most severe of criminals, the most severe offences and the most severe criminals. And they were only supposed to give out 1,000 to these prisoners, but they ended up giving out over 8,000 IPP sentences, and they absolutely blocked up the prison system. And it's, like I've mentioned, it's in absolute chaos. And a lot of these prisoners can't be released because the prison's so overcrowded. The parole hearings and the parole boards are so overwhelmed. It's taken too long to get parole hearings because there's that many prisoners waiting for paroles. And they need to do these thoroughly, obviously, to make sure that these prisoners aren't dangerous. But because everything has to be done thorough and they're understaffed, underfunded, these prisoners are waiting to be released, and they're going sometimes 10 years over tariff. There's lads that have getting 80-month tariffs at 17-year-old, and 17 years later, they're still waiting to be released. So they could have been released by the time they were 18-year-old. They're now 34-year-old and still in prison for pinching bikes or attempted thefts of mobile phones. And these are the type of things that IPPs were dished out for. They were supposed to be kept for pedos, dangerous, violent offenders, people that have been to prison numerous times, come out and committed further offences. But a lot of people, like myself, got IPPs for the first time in prison. I got mine when I was 21-year-old. I committed the offence when I was 20. 21-year-old, I got IPP. I'm 38-year-old now, and I'm still serving this sentence. I'm still at probation monthly, and I got recalled to prison after 9.5 years. I committed a further offence, which I deserved prison for, but I spent nearly 3 times the amount that I would have normally spent if I was just a normal prisoner. But because I was IPP, I'd done nearly a 40-month sentence for something that I should have only done 2 months in prison for. But or 2 to 4 months, so it was like 3 to 4 times the amount of time a normal prisoner would have been in. But I'll just tell you a few facts here about the numbers of IPP prisoners. It'll be different now because this was December 2022. There was 1,394 unreleased IPP prisoners in custody in England and Wales. In addition to these unreleased IPP prisoners, there were 1,498 recalled IPP prisoners in custody, making 2,892 IPP prisoners in total. As of the 31st of December 2022, all but 35 unreleased IPP prisoners had passed their tariff date. So there's over 1,000 IPPs 10 years over the tariff point. So out of these IPPs, when they got, say, 1 to 2 year tariff, so they could have been out after 1 to 2 years, 15 years later, 10, 12, 11, all these years later, these prisoners are still in and haven't been released. And they're now saying that they're not being released because they pose a threat or because they're dangerous, because the majority aren't dangerous. They've done the sentences. They've matured whilst in prison. They've done these offences whilst they were teenagers. And they're now saying that they're not being kept in because they're dangerous. They're being kept in because of their mental health. But the mental health is caused through the IPP. So how can that be justified? How can you keep somebody in prison because they've lost their mind And they haven't lost the mind where they're dangerous to other people. They've lost the mind where they've actually lost the plot because they've been in prison that long. They're self-harming, they're cutting themselves up, and they can't be released because every time they come up for this parole here, and they're now saying that because they're suffering with the mental health, they can't be released back into society. But they're suffering with the mental health because of the IPP. So then what do you do with these prisoners? Give them help. Don't just leave them for another 12 months. Come up for another parole hearing and then say to them that you're suffering with your mental health still, so you can't be released. If you're suffering with mental health, which a lot of them are, and this is like extreme mental health, over 80 IPP prisoners have committed suicide, and there's thousands more suffering with mental health because of the knockbacks. They can't see an end point, there's no release date, and because they're suffering with the mental health, and some of these mental health disorders like bipolar, personality disorders, it makes them act irrationally. They might be aggressive, or not aggressive, they might be responding towards the screws with, they might class, an aggressive attitude. So this is getting marked down, so when they come up for the parole hearing, they're saying they've acted in an aggressive manner, even though they haven't shown aggressive tendencies like hit people or hit prisoners or prison staff. But because they're swearing and they're being aggressive verbally, that is stopping them from being released. But they're acting this way because they're in this cell 24 hours a day nearly. They can't see an end date. Their heads are mashed. They're not getting no mental health. And they're acting in that manner because that's the only way they can express themselves. But by expressing themselves, they're then getting knocked back on the parole hearings. So it's just a constant, vicious cycle, an ongoing nightmare that they can't get out of. And like I've mentioned previously on the IPP ones that I've done, because what we're going to see, I'm quite intelligent. I know how to use my skills. I don't act aggressively whilst in prison or out of prison. And I knew how to conduct myself, and I knew how to get onto my parole hearing, do everything I had to do the courses, reduce my risk, prove that I'm a reformed and different person, and then get released. But there's people in prison that aren't mentally mature. They can't act in that manner. They don't know how to do that. They can't read and write. They're dyslexic. And all these things that are beyond their control, like being dyslexic, can't read and write, they can't do the courses because they haven't got the intelligence. But because no fault of their own, because they haven't got the intelligence to do it, this is a reason to knock them back on the parole hearing. You haven't done your courses, but you can't get on your course because you haven't got the mental capacity to do it. So the instructors on the course, or the tutors, when they're assessing you, they're saying that these people need one-to-one. They can't do the course, they can't sit in a group. They haven't got the mental capacity to take in what's being said to them. So they come up for parole hearing and they've been knocked back because they haven't done the courses. But they can't do the courses because they cannot. And they can't do one-to-ones because they're understaffed. So 8 years down the line, they're still getting the same reason. You still haven't done the courses. But they can't do the courses because they need the one-to-one, but they haven't got the staff to do it. So what do? They keep knocking them back. And 10 years down the line, they're still in. So what are you supposed to do with these prisoners? And these prisoners, some of them now, the ones that are still here, because like I've mentioned, over 80 have killed themselves, the poor souls, rest in peace. But yes, I know a lot of people will be saying, well, what about all the victims, what they've caused on the outside? They're in prison for the punishment. A lot of them do think about the victims, but you've got to think about the prisoner. The prisoners in there, they've been told they need to serve 2 years. But how can they justify keeping them in for 15 years? There's murderers that have done less time than that. Murderers get in to do 12 to 15-year tariff sometimes. They go into prison, but because they've got a long tariff, they've got time to do the courses along the way. And by the time they come up for the parole, they've done everything that's been asked of them because they've had that long in prison to do it, and they get released. But then they've got these IPPs that because it's every 12 months for parole hearings, or 18 months to 2 years, and they haven't had time to do it, it's just constant knockbacks. But then they're getting moved to different prisons to do these courses, and they're not getting done. So you can see how this is all happening, and they're all getting left behind. And there is a lad who I've seen in the press, and I've heard from different people through my YouTube channel, who is in HMP Golf, and he's got the nickname Joker. And the reason why he's got that nickname is because he's carved a big smile in his face, both sides, because he's been in prison that long. His head's gone off the IPP, He can't get released, so he's self-harming to try and make himself feel better. He's got cuts all over his body, his arms, his face, his chest is covered in scars where he's constantly cutting himself, and that's his release from prison. And when I've said he's called the Joker, he's carved a big smile in his face. He's done that so he looks like the Joker, and he wants to make himself look happy so people look at him. But that just shows how far gone he's gone mentally because of all these knockbacks with IPP. And he's obviously walking around with his smile upside down because he's unhappy, and he's carved that in his face just to prove a point to people and show people what this sentence has actually done to him. And there was another person, I think it was in Goth as well, I've seen in the press. It was in the papers where he carved in his stomach free and then hung himself, strapped himself up and hung himself in the pad and scratched on his body free. He's finally free, which is, when I see it, I'm getting goosebumps and tingling because it's so soul destroying hearing things like that, thinking that the only way out for these people now is to kill themselves and get released from prison in a box. And that's the only way some of them feel that they're ever going to be released from the prison to get out of them gates. The only way to do it is by taking your own life and getting out of them gates in a box and finally being free. And I can understand why they do it and why they would want to do that. Because if you haven't got people on the outside, like a family support like I've had, which I've always had, if you haven't got a family support, you haven't got people behind you wanting you to be released, and you're just getting belittled all the time in prison, you're getting put down, knockback after knockback, eventually you're just going to kill yourself, and that's what a lot of them are doing, which is a sad, sorry state of affairs. And like I said, there's so many of them still in prison now on the IPPs. But the IPP was actually abolished in 2012. And when they abolished it, they said it was inhumane and that the sentence should never have been brought out. But all the IPPs that have already got this sentence it wasn't retrospective. When it was abolished, it wasn't retrospective across the board, whereas they abolished all the IPPs completely. So how can they say that the sentence is inhumane, but yet keep everybody on them? I mean, there is a lot of MPs fighting for us. It's more so a one called James Darley. But even the new Justice Secretary, I think he's called Alex Chalk, I think it is. I know his second name's Chalk. He's actually for IPPs as well. And there is a lot of MPs backing the IPPs, wanting them scrapped completely. And like I've mentioned, James Darley, he's been fighting for us IPPs for years, and he wants them scrapped. And even David Blunkett, who was the Home Secretary at the time, who brought the IPPs out, says he actually has nightmares about it. He says he wished he never brought it out. It's the biggest stain on the UK prison system, and he wishes he never brought this IPP out. But if all of these people, these MPs that are in power, if they're all saying that it's inhumane, it should never have been brought out, he has nightmares over it, then why are we and the people in prison still serving this sentence? If all of these people are backing it and they're wanting it changed, why can't they just re-sentence everybody and get this IPP, this nightmare, finally over and done with and out of the way? Because the IPP has been going on too long, and it was brought up in Parliament a few months back. I had a big debate about it, and it looked very, very, very good. Like, it would look like it was going in our favour. But since then, they've brought it up, they've brought it to the public's attention again, so it looks good in the public, looks good in the media. They're doing something with the IPPs. But then since then, everything's went quiet. Nothing's been said. There's nothing getting done about the IPPs. But the victims' families, when I say victims, I mean the people that committed suicide in prison, because they've now went from being a prisoner to a victim. They've now become the victim of the IPP. So the IPP prisoners that have committed suicide, it was in the Houses of Parliament, I think, a couple of weeks back, that they had like an art an art gallery, and it had pictures of inmates. It had inmates who had wrote letters saying how they feel. And the Houses of Parliament actually held this gallery inside there. So it just goes to show that they are sympathising and they are sort of letting people talk about the IPPs and trying to do something with it. But it just keeps getting brushed under the carpet time after time. But what they could do, like I've mentioned as well, if anyone's been watching my previous videos on IPPs, yes, there is, out of these thousands of people that are in prison, there is dangerous people, more so the predators that are in for child offences. These people do need to be kept in prison. But what about the ones that have committed minor offences and got the IPP and they've been branded the same as these and they're not getting released? So I would suggest, or this is what has been suggested in the Parliament, about resentencing everybody. Resentence everybody individually and give the ones that need it, give them another sentence. Resentence everybody, and the ones that are dangerous, that pose an imminent threat to the public, keep them on IPP or give them something similar where they won't be released until they're no longer a threat. But the ones that aren't a threat, which is probably 90% of them, get them resentenced, get them the help they need, get them released back into the community and help them. Because like I've mentioned, they've went from being a perpetrator to a victim. And people will be sitting, some people will be watching this who are against prisoners and don't like hearing about prisoners being classed as victims. They'll be saying, like, they deserve it. What about the victims? But again, the prisoner has now become the victim of the IPP. They're committing acts of what's classed as prison, acts of violence against themselves by mutilation, self-mutilation, cutting the bodies up, arms, heads, every part of the body. It's now self-harming, which is classed as an act of violence, which is being used against them to stop them from being released. And these are the type of things that the IPPs are having to come up against on parole hearings. Now, when I was back in on my recall, there was a lad from down Bradford who I become quite pally with. And I used to help him write letters, help him exercise, help him get fit, and just help be a friend to him because he'd been in prison for 12 years and his tariff was 4. So he could have been out after 4 years. And he used to be a drunk on the streets. Him and his friend had an argument and he ended up beating his friend up and he got IPP for it. Now, he kept his head down for 8 years throughout his sentence. He had no trouble for 8 years throughout his sentence. But every time he come for parole, they said that he needed to do something to prove that he was reformed and show that he was a changed person. And to do that, he had to do these courses. And one of them was a violent management course. I think it might have been CALM, which stands for Controlling Anger and Learning to Manage Emotions. But this course was in a different prison. It took years to get him to this prison. He got transferred to the prison. Then that prison actually discontinued doing the course and he had to go somewhere else. So for 8 years, this was ongoing. He'd done everything he could to try and prove that he was changed. He was a changed person. The prison had actually sorted his head out. He was free of the drink. He was free of drugs. And his head was so clear, he got in a better mindset. But 8 years down the line, a knockback again. You haven't done the course, knockback. And that was the final point for him. He was either going to take his own life or start using drugs. And this was when spice came on the scene. So someone offered him a bit of spice and he tried it. And he told us when he had the spice and he comatose and he fell over onto the bed and he was in that vegetative state, which a lot of you would have seen the videos, what happens when people take spice. He said when he took the spice, it felt like he was released from prison. So he became addicted to spice. He was taking it at every opportunity. And that was his release from prison. So what happens 12 months later when he comes up for his parole hearing? Because he's using drugs, it's a knockback. It's an 18-month knockback because he's using drugs. And like I mentioned, when I was in with him, I think it was something like 12 years he'd been in. And that is the type of things that are happening. He was free of the drugs whilst I was in there, but he had to go and get parole hearing to go to Category D. And just as I left, he got Category D, and I don't know what's happened to him now. But I wish him the best, and hopefully he's getting out. He went to Category D, and he's moved on with his life and put this behind him. But these are the things that's happening with the IPPs, and I just wanted to bring it to my viewers' attention and bring it to the public attention, because a lot of people out here in the community can't believe what's actually going on with these IPPs. And when you explain it to people, it's not like they don't believe you, but they can't believe that this is actually happening. And these people out in the community who are law-abiding citizens, who have never been in trouble themselves, they don't agree with the IPPs. And a lot of the victims of the people, the prisoners that are in prison now, a lot of the victims have actually spoke up and said, yes, they deserved what they'd done to us, they deserved the prison. But the victims are even coming forward and saying that this is outrageous, they shouldn't be in prison for this long. So that's the type of things that's going on with the IPPs. I'll just have a quick look on this IPP fact sheet to see if there's anything else that is going on with the IPPs. So it says on here, early criticisms of the sentence. So from their introduction, IPP sentences were much criticised. Key early issues identified including the provision was too broad and caught up less serious offenders. The many prisoners serving IPP sentences, particularly those with short minimum terms, put additional strain on the prison and parole systems because prisoners could not access interventions they needed to demonstrate they were no longer a risk and so could be released. So obviously that's just going over what I actually mentioned just before. But again, this is a government website that I'm on here, and I'll just tell you when it says what are IPP sentences. So sentences of imprisonment for public protection were available for courts to impose from 2005 to 2012. They were designed to detain offenders who pose a significant risk of causing serious harm to the public through further serious offences in prison until they no longer posed such a risk. IPP sentences are indefinite as opposed to fixed-term sentences. They have a minimum term that must be served in custody, sometimes called a tariff. The prisoner can only be released once the parole board is satisfied the prisoner no longer needs to be confined for the safety of the public. Release is never automatic, and prisoners can be detained indefinitely if the parole board decides it is not safe to release them. So some of these lads and lasses who got IPPs of 2 years at the ages of 17, 18, 19, 20 could potentially be in prison when they're 60-year-old and never be released if they can't behave in prison because of a 2-year tariff. And when released, a person serving an IPP sentence will be on licence subject to conditions. Breaching the conditions of the licence may result in the person being recalled to prison. If recalled, a person must remain in prison until the parole board is satisfied that the custody is no longer necessary for public protection. The licence will be in force indefinitely until its termination. People serving an IPP sentence are eligible to have termination of their licence considered by the parole board 10 years after their first release. So again, like I've mentioned, when it's on about breaching and getting recalled to prison, what's happening at the minute, when someone gets recalled to prison, they have to wait between 12 to 18 months just to get a parole hearing because the paroles are that backlogged. Because obviously the prisoners that have been in for a certain amount of time or a long time, they've got priority over the ones that have been recalled. So the recalled prisoners, who are 90% of them or 80% of them, I've read somewhere up, have never committed a further offence. So they've never been brought up into the police station. They've never charged them. They've never been caught, or they've never done an offence, sorry. They've never been caught committing offences, and they've never been charged with an offence. It's all to do with being breached by probation for non-criminal offences. So having arguments with probation, having disputes, or being late at probation, or being late going back to the hostel. These people are being recalled to prison, and they're having to wait 12 to 18 months just to have a hearing. But in that 12 to 18 months, if the prisoner has gotten into an altercation on the wing, say somebody's come up, they might have been out of their heads on drugs, and they're starting on them, or they're trying to bully and intimidate them. If the prisoners then reacted back in a violent manner, or tell them to do one, or getting into an altercation, or getting into a fight, something that's happened because of somebody else, this other prisoner will be released because they're on a fixed term, but because this prisoner's IPP, they'll come up for the parole hearing 18 months later and they'll get a knockback because they've had a fight on the wing, or they've had an altercation with an officer, they've told an officer to do one, or they've acted verbally aggressive and they come up for parole, get a knockback. So these people that have been recalled to prison for not committing further offences, but for breaching the conditions or being late to probation appointment, they've been recalled to prison, they've gotten into an altercation in prison, they're in prison for 3 to 5 years for not even committing an offence. So how can they justify something like that? And these are the things that need to be brought up and discussed thoroughly in Parliament, which is happening, by the way. If you go back, there's another IPP video. I'll probably put the link in the description. And I've actually broadcast what Alex Chalk said in the Parliament. So hopefully it'll be brought back up again soon and the IPPs will be resentenced, because I know for I was going to say a fact. I know for a fact that something will happen with the IPPs, because they cannot continue going on and on with this sentence when potentially people on a 2-year tariff could spend 40, 50 years in prison. But then again, if you look at the likes of Charles Bronson, he got, which was similar to IPP, he got a 2-strike life sentence, which is exactly the same as an IPP. The conditions are the same. It's 99 years. It's just, it was called something different back then. It was 2 strikes. Now it's IPP. But the IPPs were dished out to too many people, thousands of people, whereas the 2-strike lifers were dished out to people who'd committed an offence, been to prison, went out and committed further violent offence. Then they're getting a life sentence. And that's what Charles Bronson got. And he's been in prison for nearly 50 years. So we could have thousands of Charles Bronsons in another 30 to 40 years. But if these prisoners are still in 30 to 40 years' time, they'll be a lot more dangerous and volatile than Charles Bronson, because they'll have lost their heads completely, and there'll be thousands of them, and the system will not be able to cope, and they'll not know what to do with them. So it's best to get this nipped in the bud and sorted out before the situation escalates and it gets to the point where it's irreversible. Because at the minute it is reversible. They can resentence everybody, give everybody the help they need, reduce them gradually. I'm not saying release them imminently. Reduce them gradually down the system, get them to the point where they're fit for release, and get them back out and get this sentence over and done with, and get the never-ending nightmare put to bed. But I think I've covered enough in this episode about the IPPs. But again, if you are enjoying the content, remember to comment, like, and subscribe. But if there's any more topics you would like us to cover, or anything more on the IPPs, or if there's any IPPs watching this in the community or families of IPPs, drop us an email. The email's in the description. Come on my channel and share your story and get this IPP highlighted a whole lot more than what it is now. And I'm willing to get people on for interviews and broadcast people's stories and let people know what's actually going on. But thank you for watching, everybody. Take care.